Glenn, how are you?
Hi, Josh. I'm fine. How you doing?
Good. We've been on a lot before and a lot together before, but maybe we should
introduce ourselves. It's been a long time since we've been on together also. Yeah. I'm Glenn Loury. I teach economics and social sciences at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island.
Josh Cohen. I teach political science, philosophy, and law at Stanford University, and I am editor of Boston Review. Have a new issue getting printed on Tuesday. New issue printed on Tuesday.
Congratulations! See, you have this cycle in your life where there's always a new issue. So
that's right. Yeah, there are. It's not like the academic cycle. There's actually something to get done, and there are deadlines and that kind of thing. It's good.
Yeah, I know. I've been sitting here for years without doing a whole lot. I sometimes feel. Right. Although hopefully someone will rush in and say, "Oh no, Glenn, that's not true."
Not true. So
anyway, what's up?
Yeah, so we have talked pretty often over the past 2 years on Blogging Heads, and one thing that I thought we might start off with, I suppose maybe it's a little bit self-indulgent, but I think it might be worth doing.
Ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Nobody really holds us accountable for anything that we say here. It's probably inconsequential, so it doesn't matter.
Tell me you're not going to suggest that we hold ourselves accountable.
But we should hold ourselves accountable.
Oh, no.
So start off by reflecting a little bit on a couple of the things, 2 or 3 things that we've said over here for the past year or two, and that we've been wrong about. And I have a few favorite candidates for myself that
I got some candidates for you too, Josh, as I recall some of our arguments. But no, I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean the first one, and not one that I want to dwell on, is that I was 6 months ago very pessimistic about anything happening on healthcare, and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I now think that was an excess of pessimism. I mean, but I don't want to dwell on that because maybe I'll unfortunately be right about that, and there won't be any serious reform. But there are two other things.
I just want to understand what you're saying about healthcare. Yeah. It's not that you thought the plan was not a good idea, and that's what you were pessimistic about. Right. It's that you thought it might not get through. And
I thought that there wouldn't be. I thought it would be like a replay of 1993, 1994, and a series of other episodes over the course of the 20th century where there were big efforts. Healthcare is.
Can I object to that narrative? I know you've got a list, but let me just, we're on healthcare, and these are things that you were wrong about, okay?
Yeah.
So the thing I'm objecting to in the narrative is we've been trying since Teddy Roosevelt, nobody's got it done. It just sounds like it's too much of a setup for Barack Obama to be FDR by getting something done no matter what it is, and it really doesn't matter what it is. And I think it actually matters a great deal what it is, and that's the thing that we should be arguing about, not about whether or not something gets done, about exactly what's getting done. So that, there's something in the American political psyche that is this kind of pathology that won't let us get health care done. We tried, we failed, we tried, now we're going to get it done. And I don't know, is that right? I mean, is that obviously right? So let me put it this way.
Yeah.
If the Americans are immune to the welfare state, where was the political argument about our collective obligations to each other that got ratified in an election so that now we have a different, let's say, more Northern European attitude about the welfare state than we had before? We never had that argument.
No, we didn't.
So whatever was in the way of health care is still in the way, or is not in the way, and never was in the way, or if you follow my logic.
Yeah. So there have been a series of efforts at reform. They have all lost. There is at least one thing that Obama has arguably done right on healthcare reform that the Clintons didn't do right in 93, 94, which is that he said, here are some parameters, but where the White House is not going to write the legislation. Congress is going to have to do its work. I think that was an understandable, but nevertheless, with 2020 hindsight, a serious strategic mistake by the Clinton people. There is also the fact that this problem has been hanging around for a long time. There's, whether it's 30 million people or 45 million people who are uninsured, costs keep going up. There is big political support for some kind of reform. So I agree with you that it matters hugely whether the reform is a good reform or a bad reform. And I'm not sure that that the reform that comes out will be a really good reform, although I think it's probably going to be better better than the status quo and better than the legislation looked like it was going to be 3 or 4 months ago. But it remains to be seen. There's a lot of damage that can be done between now and the time that something gets passed. But my skepticism was really just about whether or not there was going to be any big healthcare reform passed at all, and in particular, the current numbers on the Senate Finance Committee bill are that by a decade down the road, you're going to get 25 million people with insurance who would not otherwise be covered. There's still going to be a pretty large number of people who are uninsured, but I was predicting that you weren't going to get anything so substantial as that. I think another thing that I think I was this one I think I have a better sense about the source of the mistake, and it's more disturbing to me is. So when we had the surge in Iraq in 2007, there were lots of people, including people who were very close to the ground, who said, "This is ridiculous. It's not going to do any good, and all it's going to do." And I think and then people like me who are not very close to the ground, but reading different sources, and there are some you believe and some you don't believe. I believe the ones that said that this was not going to do any good because basically it was ideological. Those were people who had correctly, I think, opposed the war going in, as I had, and they were then saying, well, surge isn't going to do any good, so I opted for that view. And I think in a complicated way, in an interestingly complicated way, I think that view was mistaken. When I say interestingly complicated, I mean I think why the surge worked to the extent that it did is a pretty tough issue to diagnose, and I don't think it was just the surge. So there was just a piece on McChrystal in the Times on Sunday, and there was a British guy who's quoted in the article as saying what seems pretty plausible, which is that if they had tried the surge in 2004, it would have been a disaster. The difference between 2004 and 2007, well, it was really several-fold. First of all, you had more of a functioning government in Iraq. But also, basically, the Sunnis had been beaten. There had been a big civil war in Iraq, and I think there was a general sense in the Shia community by 2007 that there was not going to be a reemergence of Sunnis, and so the civil, and to that extent, there had been a civil war, and the civil war was sort of, winding down with a clear winner and a clear loser. And then what happened was that once the Sunnis were defeated, then there started being a lot of internecine fighting among the Shias, and there were accusations that the Mahdi army was turning into a bunch of gangs, and so the surge then was inserted in a situation where its likelihood of success was greater. But I think the effects on the ground since late 2007 and into 2008 to now are, the circumstances there are much, much better. I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which this owes to the surge, but I think people who I was believing and things that I was saying were much more skeptical than was appropriate. We have a good article.
How is somebody like you, with due respect, supposed to have any clue about whether or not the surge is going to work?
Yeah, right.
I mean, you don't have the ability, I think, the expertise, the experience, the savvy to be able to assess that. So ultimately, what we're talking about here is how we use, specialized and expert knowledge that comes from a variety of sources of a variety of credibility and ideological coloration and formulate opinion. But you can be forgiven for having been wrong about it. I think what you might not be forgiven for is not having been open-minded about it. That's really what you're saying.
That's exactly the distinction that I think is the right one to draw here. You're absolutely right that, we have these conversations, and they're on blogging heads, but in life more generally, we have conversations about political issues. We're not experts on them. We draw on sources, And there was a disagreement in 2007 about whether or not the surge was going to do any good or not. There were people who went as far, and this was something that I think we talked about at the time, where move on.
Josh, I'm sorry I have to interrupt.
Yeah.
But my dog is going crazy here, no kidding.
Yeah.
And I'm going to have to take him outside, okay?
Okay.
So can we just stop? And if you can just hang on the phone, and I'll be right back again.
Yes.
All right, we're back in business.
Back in business.
Yeah.
I think you're right that there's a big there's a situation that we're typically in, as there are lots of stuff that we talk about. It's true of everybody who's engaged with politics.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff you talk about. You're not an expert on. You draw on sources, and then you have to be careful. And I think in this case, and
exactly.
This is why I feel. In this kind of mea culpa spirit, I think it's an important one to mention, is that I think I just believed the people who I had agreed with in general about the war. And as you remember, this was an incredibly contentious issue at the time. I think we had a conversation about the issues about the surge when Petraeus was testifying to Congress, and MoveOn.org had those. Petraeus betray us, and I think betray us, and we both thought at the time that was a really objectionable thing to say. Nevertheless, I was pretty skeptical, and
I remember too being pretty blinkered that, for example, there's this guy, I'm sure you know of him, Frederick Kagan, who's a defense intellectual at the American Enterprise Institute or some such place. And he was a big surge proponent, and I remember once just in a throwaway line, saying, "Oh man, the neocons have come upon hard times. We've fallen from Irving Kristol to Bill Kristol, and from Jerome Kagan, his father at Yale, who was a noble defender of the canon, as I recall from the culture wars of the '80s, to Frederick Kagan." And I was just so dismissive. And you're right. I do think that with pretty much if you're saying it, pretty much everybody is saying it. That on this one, Frederick Kagan was right, and others who were advocating that. And that's it is chastening to think that I was so dismissive of a serious person.
Yeah.
Because they were on the wrong side of the general posture toward, fighting wars and, going after, quote unquote bad guys in the Middle East.
Right. I mean, I think the rationale for being dismissive was you think, look, their judgment has been wrong in the past. They're driven by, kind of ideological predispositions to downplay the dangers of this job and the difficulties of it. But, as is always the case, you hold up that criticism of them, and then you want to hold up the mirror to yourself and ask if you're doing the same thing.
So we're talking about things that you got wrong. We can talk about some of the things that I got wrong, but I wanted to just stay on this point here about how you react to expertise in an ideologically charged environment in the context of Afghanistan.
Yeah. Right.
Now, okay, so the president is deliberating, and so the strategy is being reevaluated in light of the troubling elections in Afghanistan and so forth and so on, and General McChrystal and all of that, and so what do we what do we think about that? I mean, what I want to say is that I fear another 10 years into a kind of quagmire and a very difficult military and political situation, and I kind of want us to get out, and I just wonder if I'm being a Pollyanna to want that,
So those are I'm with you on the substance and with you on asking the question. I was in thinking about this, I was reminded of what happened in late '79 after the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan. I think it was December 24th, 1979. Brzezinski wrote a memo to Carter, and Brzezinski says to Carter, it was a kind of, now we've got them where we want them.
Yeah.
What he said specifically was, they have just, this is going to be their Vietnam.
I've heard this.
And the thing is, the Mujahideen and certainly bin Laden think that what brought the Soviet Union down was not, the neoconservative American foreign policy, was not the build-up during, of nuclear weapons during the Reagan administration, or military forces during the Reagan administration. What brought the Soviet Union down was the war in Afghanistan. So my guess is, they're thinking similarly. Great if there's a surge in Afghanistan because it'll be a disaster for the United States. And what I haven't seen, and these reflections about the surge are, they're important to keep in mind in thinking about this case. I would just say that what I haven't seen is a case for this counterinsurgency strategy, and I think there are three issues there. First of all, there's the if you think that something like the surge did some good in Iraq, then why not think it's going to do some good in Afghanistan? Well, the situation, the answer,
I thought the conditions were completely different.
And that's why I think it matters why the surge had some effect. There was a functioning government in Iraq. The Sunnis, I think, really had been defeated in the civil war. There was a deep division within the Shias, and there was a possibility for the government to move, for the Iraqi government to move in ways that had been, and there was a real exhaustion that had been produced by an intense civil war that had, by the time mid-2007, had been going on for 4 years. So I don't think the analogy holds much. On the issue about, there's an issue about whether this is a winnable strategy, and winning this counterinsurgency strategy really is, in the most extreme way, a case of nation and state building. I mean, you got a big place. It's a lot of rural population, a lot of tribal divisions and fighting. You have a strong insurgency. You have a horrible terrain to be fighting on, and you don't really have, a history and tradition of a functioning national state. So
Okay, but here's the thing for me. Quite apart from the specifics about Afghanistan, which you've been calling attention to just now, very important. But quite apart from that, I know this is by way of a confession, actually. I don't know what we're fighting for.
That's the third point. I agree with you.
There's this formula that people utter about making sure that Afghanistan doesn't become a sanctuary for and the base from which, we can be attacked and so on. And I don't doubt that there's a threat. I'm not saying there's no threat. Mm-hmm. But I don't know exactly what the nature or the extent of the threat is, or how contingent the threat is upon anything that happens on the ground in Afghanistan. Yeah. And I just, this war-fighting posture where we've got everything is so abstract. The enemy is abstract here. I can't locate the enemy precisely. It can't be Islamic fundamentalism. That can't be the enemy, because that war never ends, does it? So. What, and how much of what might be the long-term solution to the conflict, if I could come to understand the nature of the conflict, depends upon a force of arms versus other things. And this is not just hard power, soft power. I'm not just making, a simple dichotomy like that. But I wish someone would explain to me, are we going to be at war for 5 years, for 15 years, or for 500 years?
Yeah, well, that's where I think there are, aside from the disanalogies with Iraq, there's this issue of, whether this is a quote, winnable conflict, unquote, which is partly a question about what kind of conflict it is and what the purpose of it is. And I think the purpose has to be understood as the purpose of the counterinsurgency strategy, and the way it's being advertised really is a very long-term occupation of this place for the purposes of building an Afghan nation state, which is not, which I find, on the one hand, implausible as a strategy, but on the other, and your point, I agree with this, is if that was really necessary in order to achieve some paramount good, then you swallow hard and you do what needs to be done. But I haven't either heard the case. I mean, I think the case is something like this. Pakistan has a lot of nuclear weapons. There are lots of worries about those Pakistani nuclear weapons, and I think the case that some people think is the winning case is that you really can't. You don't have any hope of dealing with that issue if you're not doing something successful in Afghanistan. That so long as you can't. There was Bob, our fearless leader, Robert Wright, had a Blogging Heads conversation the other day in which he was asking the question, announcing it as a crazy question, which is, can't you just what's wrong with just turning Afghanistan over to the Taliban and focusing on the Pakistan issue? Well, I would like to, it is.
They're interrelated, so they're so interconnected that one can't do that.
They're so interconnected that one can't do that. That was the answer. And, but that's an answer that works at about 30 or 40,000 feet. The world is much more complicated than that. And, whatever the strategy is going to be, it's not a strategy of saying, oh, sorry, we didn't mean to be here. We're leaving. Taliban, we'll set up your quarters for you before you go, and we're going to focus on. It's a much more complicated situation than that. But the idea of going into a 10-year fight, 10 more years, we've been there 8 years already, a 10 more year fight in Afghanistan, the purpose of which is to create a strongly functioning, Afghan state out of the current situation. That doesn't seem to me like a.
Okay, let me ask you a philosopher's question, Josh. Here's another question. It's related though. Women, the status of women in a society like a society run by the Taliban.
Yeah.
Okay, is that a war-making issue?
No. And the reason I think it's not a war-making issue is not to trivialize the issue. I think it's the stuff about the situation of women in under the Taliban in Afghanistan, or comparable situation in parts of Pakistan. Those are issues of incredible importance, not just to the women who are being abused, hideously abused, and also because, generally speaking, places that where women are treated better than that are places that don't have the kind of dysfunction that. Okay, so.
So there are many reasons that one would want not to have women.
That's right, and there are reasons of incredible moral importance. But going to war, there are two issues about going to war. One issue about going to war is that a lot of innocent people are going to be killed in the best war, and that's a really bad thing, and so a terrible thing, and you only do that when the purpose is of the greatest importance, and you don't have any other way of achieving the goal. You do it only when your back is against the wall, and that's what I think. The idea that you're going to go in and fight a war, the success of which, in terms of improving conditions of women, is at best uncertain, and in which a lot of innocent people are going to die, and in which it's not obvious that all other avenues have been exhausted. So,
though it has been said, and I've always thought at the time rightly said, that were we to go into a situation like this, offer in some sense the hope of reconstructing a state or constructing a state that would be a open society and a democratic society and one that respected human rights across the board, and then pull out and then reach the judgment that, this isn't working out for us and it's not something that we can sustain over a long period of time, and as much as we would rather have it otherwise, there are realities, and as long as the homeland is not being threatened by these activities. I mean, it's not our business exactly what the domestic structure of the Afghanistan. And then the counterargument will be made, but what about the fate of the women?
Right.
And so, therefore, you may stay at war, at least on the margin, because a consideration like that weighs into the political dynamic about a very difficult judgment, like the judgment that the President of the United States is making.
So again, I mean, I think there's the issue there is it necessary? Is it effective to have a war to do that, to achieve that goal? Is that an effective strategy for achieving that goal? And because of the inevitable, incredible human costs of war, is there no other way of achieving that goal? And I think you only, go in for the use of military force when you have a goal of transcendent importance, when you think you have a reasonable prospect of success in achieving that goal, and you think there's no other way of advancing the goal than by doing something that inevitably produces a potentially very large-scale loss of innocent human life. I mean, I think that's certainly that's what's happened in Iraq. I mean, tens of thousands of people end up getting killed because of the U.S. invasion. So, I think each of those issues matters: the magnitude of the goal, the likelihood of effectiveness in achieving the goal, and is there really no other way to achieve the goal? And I don't think the case has been made in Afghanistan for that. Yeah.
So good. Let me. Can I talk about one of the things I got wrong? I think I got wrong.
Yeah.
We're holding each other accountable, or holding ourselves accountable before each other. And of course, because I have been a blogging head, regular, semi-regular, over these years, and people will know that I didn't support Barack Obama in the Democratic primary campaign. I supported Hillary Rodham Clinton. And when I look back, and I'm not, so I was, quote, was I wrong about that, close quote? Yeah, well, obviously I was wrong in that I supported, I put my money on the horse. That horse didn't win. Was I wrong about that in some more cosmic sense? Probably. I failed to appreciate and take sufficiently seriously the power of the Obama, insurgency, if I can use that term, of the Obama phenomenon. I failed to fully take its measure. But then I also have to do a kind of personal inventory thing on it. Why didn't I believe? Why couldn't I, this kind of thing? I'm sort of going back, because what I realized is I missed a tremendously exhilarating experience. A bit like the sports fan whose team falls behind, like the Angels fell behind in that game against the Yankees last night, if you watched it. I'm rooting against the Yankees, people. And then you turn the thing off in disgust, and you miss the comeback where they win in the ninth inning or whatever it might be, like that. So I deprived myself of this ride with the Obama phenomenon from beginning to end. I wouldn't invest myself in it. I wouldn't believe in it. And, what does that say about your humble servant here? Maybe a psychoanalyst could plumb that. I'd probably just assume not do it right here.
Well, I think there's an interesting
thing I'd say.
Well, I think there's an interesting question there, which maybe this is between you and your analyst, though, which is so there are a bunch of us, and I count myself in this group. I was not initially an Obama supporter. I actually was initially a supporter of, excuse my language, the scumbag, John Edwards. I'm embarrassed about that.
He did let us down, didn't he? My wife was too, and she hangs her head in shame every time his name comes up. When I became a supporter of Obama, I thought of myself as being if I can put it this way, not a "we are the ones we have been waiting for" supporter of Obama. I mean, I didn't think he was going to repeal the laws of political gravity, Right.
He was running to more to the center on a bunch of issues than Clinton, like on the health care issue, where he was getting beaten up for saying that he was not going to get everybody covered. And that's a promise he's delivering on. The health care plans are not going to get everybody covered. But I thought there was I thought there were good reasons for supporting Obama that didn't require, and I continue to think this, so there were good reasons for supporting him and for continuing to support, that didn't require going in for any of the hype about him. He just seemed like, a very, very smart, thoughtful, deliberative, some say dithering, but I think deliberative guy with a real deep engagement with a wide range of policy issues and thoughtful things to say about those issues, and somebody who was, even if he wasn't the one we were waiting for, he was capable of inspiring a bunch of people. And so I thought there were good reasons for supporting him. And I suppose the way to put the question back to you was, why did you think that you had to buy the hype in order to support him? You could have been a kind of, best of the available candidates kind of person without thinking, our savior.
Well, you're right, and I did make that separation. I guess I was a bit offended by the hype at some level, but I think also being black has something
I'm just guessing. I'm just guessing.
Because in my case, the hype was like family members coming around with T-shirts and caps from Chicago. I'm from Chicago, with Obama's likeness on it. And Obama would be on one half of the T-shirt, and Martin Luther King Jr. would be on the other half. And the thing would say, he had a dream and now the dream had come true. And then I would throw a fit.
Right.
I would just go crazy. That kind of thing made me crazy. Maybe it also made me guilty. Made me crazy intellectually because I thought that was mindless. Right. No offense intended to people, but I really did. I just thought that wasn't politically mature. Right. But then feel guilty because, Bill Cosby is carrying his parents' photographs into the voting booth with him when he cast his ballot for Obama. Yeah. Tears are flowing in Jesse Jackson's eyes in Grant Park, Chicago, when Obama ascends to the presidency or something. So, how can you not be for that? How can you not, how can you not buy that hype?
Right.
So I found myself... and then there was, as I've said, a generational aspect to it. I'm a man of a certain age, as anybody looking at me can see. Got a little gray beard here. I'm in my 7th decade of life. And I just felt like, stuff was moving so fast and my generation was being passed by somehow. Right. I really do think that was part of it. If I'm on the couch... Yeah. If I'm on the couch and everybody's got to see me go through this, I'll confess, I think I just felt like I was getting a little bit old. I think Barack Obama made me feel like I was getting old.
So the issue comes
I am getting old. I'm not old, people. I'm not old, but
I know what you mean.
Every year is another year.
I think there was not just an age thing. There was specifically also a generational thing. That is,
a generational
who had a stake in a certain way of thinking about issues about race in the United States, and Obama with
times are
moving on. This is the and it's bullshit. It's the post-racial thing, and there was a lot of people who not only thought that was wrong, but also I think dangerous and maybe offensive. But I think the issue comes back around now.
Yeah, I think I might agree with all three.
Yeah, no, I know. I think you probably did, and that was my sense. And the issue comes back around now, which is when we're evaluating the success or lack of success of Obama, do we evaluate him by reference to the hype? Because, evaluated by reference to the hype, what we have is...
He falls short, as he must have inevitably.
That's right. Both points are true. He falls short, and he must inevitably have fallen short. And so, do we want to go to people who are pushing the hype and say, see, your guy is, on earth just like the rest of us? Or do we want to say, he's doing a pretty good job. This is what I think. He's doing a pretty good job. And it's not... he doesn't live up to the hype, but what you want to do is criticize the hype, not the job. Why do I think he's doing a pretty good job? Well, I I think the stimulus bill wasn't a bad thing. I think I do believe, and maybe
it was a necessary
thing politically.
But it turned out to be a Christmas tree of sorts.
Absolutely, but that's
that's in the nature.
That's in the nature of the thing. Judge the thing by the right standards. I think, unlike Cheney, I don't see what he's doing on Afghanistan as dithering. I do think it's deliberating. Although I think I saw a comment, and I want to say mention this. Bill O'Reilly talking about the Cheney speech on Fox News. And, there are some things about Bill O'Reilly that I really don't like. I don't like all the yelling and screaming. Of course, I don't like it anymore with Keith Olbermann than I like it with O'Reilly. But, O'Reilly, when O'Reilly is on, I think O'Reilly is pretty good. He gave one of the best interviews of Obama during the campaign. In this set of comments about the Cheney speech, he didn't say, I agree with Cheney. He didn't say I disagree with Cheney. He said, Cheney is making a pretty good point. That is, Obama should either jump with the McChrystal strategy or something like that, or he should decide that he's not going to do that, or he should get up and explain what the issues are that are leading him not to make a decision between a further escalation or some alternative, maybe Joe Biden counterterrorism rather than counterinsurgency strategy. But the time had really come for him to well,
that's a point that can be made. It may not be correct, but at least it's
a totally fair point. And I think Bill Riley isn't always fair and balanced, but he sometimes is. And
But don't you think that this pushback that Obama is getting, both from inside the military ranks, where the Secretary of Defense and the White House National Security Advisor, himself a former general officer, have to say publicly that military officers need to give their advice up the chain of command and stop fronting the president. Yeah. And don't you think that Dick Cheney is speaking for people? I mean, I don't know anything about this shadowy world of defense contractors and former members of Congress and military officers, but I know it exists. There's an establishment out there. And they may not like what the president, the young, he's an African-American and his name is Barack Hussein Obama, but that's probably not the most important thing. Left of center, a president who's been going around on the world stage apologizing for America's, arrogance and miscues. And they may not like what he's doing. And while I'm not predicting a coup d'etat in these United States of America, I'm not. Still, I'm made to sit on the edge of my chair and to feel a little tingle up my spine when I hear people talking in public like that.
Talking in public like Cheney did.
Yeah, he basically called the president unfit to lead the military. He didn't say it in quite those words, but he said he's dithering while our men are dying and women in battle.
Well,
and that kind of talk, I mean, okay, it may come up here, it may come up there, but you don't want that to be the norm, I don't think.
No, you don't want that to be the norm. But this is
to me.
It's at points like this that I think we need to hold up the mirror to ourselves as well. And by ourselves, I mean us and people who are on broadly on our side of these issues. We go back to that betray us. That what I thought was really disgraceful. I mean, I've given money to MoveOn.org over the years, and I'll continue to do it sometimes, but I thought that was really awful. There was plenty of stuff said about the ability of George Bush to lead that was... I happen to agree with it in that case, but it was just, and it wasn't playing to a world of, former defense officials and military officers. But there were plenty of people saying George Bush was, incapable of leading. That he was basically he was a moron, a warmonger, and whether that's true or not, and I think there is a need for accountability on Iraq and on torture. Nevertheless, I think the criticisms were comparable. I think that's politics. It's democratic politics. People make sharp criticisms, and I think this is of a piece with these issues about Fox News. Their work.
Yeah, let's talk about that. But let me just say one thing on that,
Yeah.
though, Josh, because I don't want to be misunderstood. I wasn't saying don't criticize Obama. I criticize him myself, and have at him. I was saying I'm unsettled by a tone that I'm detecting in the criticism and some of the source of the criticism, and fear that the thing might go really quite high and quite deep in the power establishment of the United States of America. And I just want to watch it. I want to keep my eye on it.
On that, I completely agree with you. It's not, and I think I think there's the tone of the criticism, is sometimes disturbing. I think, on the other hand, I think maybe to be a little bit too fair and balanced here, I think the tone of some of the pushback is disturbing. I think there's been a lot of
okay. So let's hear about that.
A lot of whining.
What the White House has been saying about taking on Fox News.
I think this is just I find. Glenn Beck I find unbearable. Sean Hannity I mostly find unbearable. I find it hard to watch him, although occasionally I think he's a sharp guy and he's interesting. He's a Reagan Republican. It helps to hear somebody who's a kind of Reagan Republican, as is Sarah Palin. And it has a certain kind of meaning, and it helps to hear what I find it helpful to hear what he has to say. As I said, I think Bill O'Reilly is okay. But let me put it to you this way: if you're sitting at Fox News right now, you're Roger Ailes. You're sitting at Fox News right now, and you're hearing this pushback against what you're up to. Are you celebrating or are you worried? They can say, you're celebrating.
You're not worried.
Not worried at all.
The First Amendment to protect you.
They pretend that they're worried. They say, first it's going to be us, and then then they're going to shut down the media. This is a complete horseshit. But I don't think they're worried at all, but they're celebrating. They're celebrating because they are doing the classic thing that an adolescent does. The adolescent, nags and is a pain in the ass and irritates until finally the adolescent gets, is sufficiently provocative to get a reaction, and then the adolescent feels really good. And I think that's what these people at Fox News are doing, and I think these complaints that are coming out of the administration about what Fox News is up to are basically like the classic mistake of the adult who gives into the provocations of the kid. They should.
Okay, but there's another point here, Josh, that I want to see how you react to, and that is the White House has had an incredibly, in the Barack Obama campaign prior to the coming into the White House, an incredibly favorable press on the whole.
Yes,
a fawning press. An uncritical press at many different points and junctures. And therefore, there's something that I find, hypocritical, or maybe, well, let me just try to temper my remarks. Especially in light of what I was saying just a moment ago. Yeah. But I do find it a little bit precious that people will come out on the lawn out in front of the White House and go to the press room, and they will start complaining about how this or that was said about them that was not fair, when I think I could probably, with some effort, find a dozen or more instances where this or that might have been quite fairly said about them, but wasn't said by anybody because they're all rooting for them.
I agree with you. I think it's unfortunate when but there are people who are there are plenty of people, I think, who are critical without doing without being absurd. Glenn Beck is a sort of an absurd circus performer, a more rodeo show guy as he's more or less said himself, with his Vicks vapor rub, crying on TV.
Yeah, okay. Let me give you one issue. I know you probably get ready to say something, but just one issue. Are illegal immigrants going to end up being benefited in terms of the availability of health care by the legislation that's being considered? Okay? Now, here's what I want to say about that. I think the answer is probably yes. When everything is worked out. Not that that's in the legislation or that somebody's trying to do that. Okay? And I think it's a good thing, too.
Yeah, me too.
Okay? Because the basic motivation for this is the human rights of people. Okay? To be able to have access to health care when they're sick in a decent society. Okay? Not some people with certain kind of marks on the pieces of paper that they carry in their back pocket, but human beings generally. So I say yes, and it's a good thing too. Now, if somebody says your legislation has this property, and they're trying to make, the property being that illegal immigrants are going to benefit. And they're trying to make a political point to stop your legislation. Of course, out of survival instinct, you have to say, particularly since it's true, as a matter of the letter of the legislation, no, it doesn't. But of course, there should be a healthy public debate, shouldn't there, both about, well, if you enact a kind of entitlement of this sort, and if you realize enforcement is imperfect, certain consequences will ensue. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to discuss.
Absolutely.
And secondly, besides, I thought the motivation here was that people had a right to something, and while you may not like it, those are people too. The ones over there without papers, they're people. So rather than to manage that conversation, I guess what I'm trying to say is let there be a Fox News trying to make a partial point about this, because the overall discussion is interesting, and it's better than trying to whitewash it and shut it up and put a lid on it so that we don't talk about it at all.
I agree with that completely. I agree with the substance of what you said, that there probably will be some people who are in the country illegally who end up getting covered. First, second, I think that that's a good thing for the reasons that you gave. And third, I think that is not, because of the state of political discourse, the people who are raising that are people who think it's a bad thing that you get the coverage, and I think that's unfortunate. I think it's
and more unfortunate can be confident that a substantial plurality will think that it's a bad
That's right, and I think it would be important for people who are on the other side of the issue to be raising that and then forthrightly defending it in just the way that I think. The analogous case, and I'm going to, last point here, and then I really do have to run. Take the Acorn thing. I think it's I think Acorn generally has been a pretty good organization. They've done a lot of stuff.
I have a colleague here at Brown, a political scientist named Marion Orr, who writes books about community organizing. And he was going on and on and on about how good a thing he thought they were on the whole, not trying to defend any specific
disgraceful behavior, disgraceful, disgusting behavior by some of the people in those offices, and all the more disgraceful and disgusting because Acorn has been, on the whole and for the most part, a good organization in terms of bringing people into politics, and also a good organization in terms of, getting services for people. So, really terribly unfortunate. Now, I think it's, awful. This is one of the stories that, critics of the mainstream media are right about. The mainstream media missed the Acorn story, and the reason that the downside of the Acorn story, and how, whether it's a little downside or a big downside, I think remains an open issue. But they missed the downside of the Acorn story because they were so concerned not to raise any questions in an environment in which the organization was under attack, that they let the only people raising those questions be people who wanted to destroy Acorn. So I think, this brings us back to our topic at our opening up at the top of the hour. I think a little bit more kind of self-critical attitude, a little more holding up the mirror to ourselves on part of people who are, on our side wouldn't be such a bad thing. Instead of going.
So have you read any Pierre Bourdieu? The French sociologist. He has this concept of reflexivity that he applies to sociological analysis. That I think for the scholar, for the theorist of society, is also admonition of that sort.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, let the mirror reflect back on oneself in an analytical sense. But maybe that's for another conversation. Anyway, nice talking to you, Josh.
Okay. Bye bye.
Take good care of yourself.